Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm very excited to welcome you to tonight's talk called Modern Plans, Modern Systems, Modern Living with Cory Buckner. As an essential player in a new approach to planning and architecture, A. Quincy Jones considered all his projects to be a way of reinventing domestic life and the making of architecture. Examples include the cooperative community of Crestwood Hills, Jones and Emmons' pioneering work on system-built Eichler Homes, and innovative open plans such as Jones's own Steelhouse No. 2. Our speaker tonight is the quintessential Jones expert. Cory Buckner is a practicing architect and author with a degree in fine arts from Chouinard Art Institute and a master in architecture from UCLA, where she also studied landscape architecture. Her firm, Cory Buckner Architect, specializes in contemporary residential design and mid-century remodeling and restoration projects. Cory is the author of A. Quincy Jones, which was published by Phaidon Press in 2002 and was a finalist for the 2003 Rome Prize. She is currently working on a book by her mentor, architect Frederick P. Lyman, whose work you can see in the Getty exhibition Overdrive. And she's also working on a book on Crestwood Hills. And we have copies of her A. Quincy Jones book available for sale in the lobby of the theater, and I'm sure that Cory would be happy to sign some for you after the program if you're interested. Cory and her husband, architect Nick Roberts, own a home designed in 1947 by A. Quincy Jones, Whitney R. Smith, and structural engineer Edgardo Contini in Crestwood Hills. Through her preservation efforts, 15 of the houses from the Crestwood Hills Mutual Housing Development have been designated historic cultural monuments with the City of Los Angeles. And in recognition of this important movement that she began, she was awarded the 2002 LA Conservancy Preservation Award for the inspiring effort to preserve important examples of Southern California modernism and enhancing the sense of community in a unique neighborhood. Cory Buckner has also served on the advisory board during the development of our current exhibition on the work of A. Quincy Jones here at the Hammer, for which we are very grateful. At the end of the talk tonight, Nicholas Olsberg, who helped curate this lecture series, will join Cory on stage to moderate a Q&A. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cory Buckner.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Hammer for their wonderful enthusiasm for the work of A. Quincy Jones and his vision for better living. They've certainly honored him with this show, the programs, and the wonderful catalog. With this talk, I'd like to discuss Jones' interest in rejecting traditionally accepted forms in planning and housing. His individual experimentation and sensibility made him a true modernist. Not only were his plans inventive in regards to the efficient use of land, but he was always exploring the best or most interesting structural systems for any given project. He ended up being the first to use many new construction methods. With regards to his enormous contribution to the design of moderate-income housing, he not only met the demands of developers, but he created a way of life for the occupants of his creations. This lecture will focus on the particular area of this particular area of his expertise, tract and developer housing. As you can see by the cigarette and probably a martini just off screen, health was not one of his primary interests or obsession, but architecture was. Just to give you a brief history of the man, he was born in Kansas City, Missouri. After his parents divorced when he was 7, he moved with his maternal grandparents to Gardena, an agricultural area. His grandfather, a former banker, retired to become a farmer. The only children Jones had to play with were those of the Cabata family, who owned the neighboring plant nursery. That was to be the first introduction into the order and beauty of the Japanese culture that influenced him throughout his life. Jones' father moved to Seattle, where Jones ended up spending his last 2 years in high school so he could qualify as a resident to attend the University of Washington. At a young age, he had decided on pursuing architecture, and at that time, that school was one of the top in the country for architecture. One of his classmates, Minoru Yamasaki, designed the World Trade Center towers. Another classmate, Ruth Schneider, became his first wife, and they moved to Los Angeles after graduation. Jones worked for several architects, including Paul R. Williams, Bernard Schott, and Douglas Honnold. After constructing a duplex in Laurel Canyon, the couple divorced, and Jones joined the Navy, serving in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. After his discharge, he set up an office in one of the units of the duplex and had his first client by the end of the day. He worked continuously from then on until his death in 1979 at the age of 66. Jones' first large-scale housing project fell into his lap in 1946. In Los Angeles, a group of returning war veterans and studio musicians formed a cooperative called Mutual Housing. With 300 contributing members, the MHA purchased 800 acres in Brentwood. After interviewing architects, including Richard Neutra, the MHA members settled on Doug Honnold, Jones' former employer. Honnold brought in John Lautner, shown on the left, standing, and Jones, who is seated on the right. The rest of the team included architects Whitney R. Smith and Francis Lockwood, structural engineer Edgardo Contini, and landscape architect Garrett Ekbo. This happy band of brothers dissolved when Lautner started an affair and later married Doug Honnold's wife. The three remaining players after Honnold and Lautner parted ways and left the project were Jones, Smith, and Contini, who became the joint venture for the community project, and Garrett Ekbo remained on board as the landscape architect. The program was to design 350 lots on 800 acres of sloping terrain in the hills of Brentwood. The community is now known as Crestwood Hills. The cooperative wished to have common shared facilities, which the joint venture planned for the center of the community. Several factors make this site plan interesting and innovative. It was the first large-scale housing development in a hillside area. Every house had a view and a private open space, while front doors opened to the street to provide a sense of community. One of the four founding members of the MHA, Leonard Krupnick, played a crucial role in the formation of the cooperative, having been raised in a commune in Wisconsin. He had experienced cooperative living firsthand, and he educated the community members on the benefits of cooperative living, citing examples from around the world. This photo is one of the mills in Rochdale, England, a cooperative shop formed in 1844. In fact, one of our streets in Crestwood Hills is named after this community, but unfortunately our founding fathers added an E, so it's pronounced Rochdale. As a housing cooperative, every member purchased a share in the association. The membership bought the membership bought the property and hired the architects and contractors. Committees were formed to oversee every aspect of the creation of this unusual, groundbreaking community. As in many of Jones' community plans, by making the residential lots fairly small, a large portion of the land could be used for the communal facilities. Jones believed that the best home is part of a total community with facilities to learn, shop, worship, and play, all part of living. Shown here within a park is the MHA Community Center, nursery school, swimming pool, open-air theater, gas station, baseball field, restaurant, laundry, shoe repair, a variety store, medical and administration buildings, a beauty parlor, and a plant nursery. It was a very ambitious program. Another one of the four founding members, Jules Salkin, had played in the string quartet during summers at Taliesin West, which is shown here. Salkin had a sophisticated eye for architecture and was a major player in the MHA development. The joint venture submitted 10 modern plans to the members, but these were rejected as too modern. The architects, knowing of Salkin's interest in Wright, enlisted the help of an employee who had been an apprentice at Taliesin, Jim Charlton. At Taliesin West, note the exposed beams, the slanted roof line, and clear-story windows between large, gusseted, slanted posts. With Salkin in mind, Charlton came up with a model very reminiscent of Taliesin West. This model and several others were accepted by the members, and 9 basic floor plans with variations on each were prepared for construction documents. The community members were politically to the left, primarily Jewish, and wished the architecture to reflect their progressive ideas. This dramatic roofline was a feature of the MHA Model 302. The floating dynamic roofline and extreme cantilever challenged the norms of residential architecture. This early brochure shows an unusual floor plan for a developer house, introducing angled walls, built-in seating, and an unusual fireplace massing. The dramatic fireplace as a central feature became a design element that Jones used throughout his work. Smith and Jones purchased a lot in Mount Washington in order to build the MHA 108 to show the community members a 3-dimensional model of their vision. Many materials such as concrete block, plywood, and plate glass had been improved during the war efforts, and most modern architects were eager to use them. Despite designing the structure on a module to accommodate inexpensive sheets of plywood and using exposed building materials, Jones and Smith lost money on this venture, which should have given them an inkling of what would be in store for the contractors selected to build the project. The pilot house brochure, filled with pictures, descriptions, and plans, was presented to the community, and the design was enthusiastically embraced. The house still exists and is an historic cultural monument with the city of LA. With the uses of plentiful glass and decks, the small house of 1,180 square feet seems much larger. Several features never seen before in developer houses were implemented in the pilot house. The use of a light soffit brought in additional daylight, which helped brighten a house that had unpainted wood surfaces. Above the light soffit are plywood panels that open with a bronze lever that extends through the soffit below. The panels slide open to expose the sky beyond and a screened area for ventilation. Slanted glass cut down on the reflection at night, making it easier to view the city lights beyond. Built-in furniture eliminated the need for new families to purchase costly furniture, and seamless glass corners created additional drama and extended the space of the living room. The Model 302 was used for one of the first brochures used to increase the membership. The development was advertised as a cooperative community in a natural setting with sweeping views of the Pacific shore. Photographs of the recently built pilot house were used throughout. The brochure advertised an open, flexible, modern plan with built-ins and a dramatic roofline. According to this brochure, the housewife reigns. The newest electrical thermidor appliances, built-ins, and convenient living arrangements were to make the housewife's work a pleasant chore. And here are some of the reigning housewives. They look like a pretty happy bunch. This is a picture of the groundbreaking in 1946, and the odd structure in the back is actually a plant nursery. You can see from this photo that the members were a pretty hip crowd. While the grading was advertised as minimal, the photo reveals the cuts that had to be made on the steep terrain were fairly radical. The terraced plan allowed for the maximum of lots with spectacular ocean and city views. As the first structure built in the Crestwood Hills community in 1947, the site office became a space for the architects to work and an area where members could meet to select their plans. It is adjacent to the park and was to be turned into an arts and crafts building once the community was completed. It was built as one open rectangular space. This photo shows the interesting use of repetitive modular frames with gussets at the double posts, similar to the pilot house in Taliesin. As Jones stated, the advantage of post and beam methods arise from the fact that between the supports, complete flexibility is possible. The roof structure can be made of a variety of materials. In 1952, the office was sold to a private party, and it was converted to a house using the Model 102 as a plan for the kitchen and bathrooms. This is a structure today which my husband, Nick Roberts, and I purchased in 1999 and restored, and it'll be on the tour on Saturday. This is a recent photo that was taken by John Dooley Photography, who has photographed most of the original houses for our upcoming book on Crestwood Hills. I've been fortunate in being commissioned as the architect in charge of restoring and remodeling a dozen of the original structures. This interior shot shows the angled gusseted posts. Kentile asphalt flooring was used as a finished material in most of the MHA houses and was still available when we began our restoration. The structure was used as the cover to the book of 27 plans presented to the community members. Each model was represented on 2 pages, which included a floor plan, elevations, a perspective drawing, and a brief description. The handwritten notes shown here are the original cost to build this particular model, one of the largest and most expensive of the plans. The cost of each lot was $2,000, so an investment of around $17,000, including the site, for this particular model verged on high-end construction. A typical developer home sold between $8,000 and $10,000 at that time. As Jones stated, if one is willing to accept the usual method of land development today, that of dividing the area into the maximum number of lots per acre compatible with the local zoning laws, there is not much room for planning better communities. With this approach, try as they may, the most efficient layout will always result in a grid pattern, which provides rows of identically shaped lots in a pattern familiar to everyone. This method can hardly be expected to produce any results except unrelieved monotony, a fault admitted by every builder and obvious to every buyer. With the MHA development, Jones rejected the traditionally accepted regimented layout and experimented with placing the new houses at different angles to the street, thus providing a greater sense of privacy from the street and a feeling of luxurious garden space between each house. This early interest in individual experimentation and rejection of sanctioned forms set the stage for his profound contribution to developer projects. These are some of the houses shown in the previous slide when they were recently completed in 1948 as part of the first grouping of 30 houses built. Despite the small lots, each house has its own private outdoor space. Great care was taken in protecting views for the individual homes. Houses were placed on hillside lots stepping down the hill, providing each house with spectacular city and ocean views. An architecture and tree committee was formed and still functions today to maintain views and character. The contractor hired to build the first 30 houses ended up paying $30,000 of his own money to finish each house. Needless to say, he went bankrupt. In this photo, Mr. and Mrs. Mha are shown sitting in front of their recently completed house on Deerbrook Lane. Roy Mha, an attorney, took copious notes throughout the construction process, and here reveals the care that was taken in building each house. They were built per very detailed plans provided by the architects. Throughout Jones' career, he maintained a high standard of practice and insisted builders do the same. During the Northridge earthquake, only one house suffered a broken window. The Mha were very proud of their house and hired a professional photographer to photograph their new home, furnished with the latest modern furniture of the day. Here, Mrs. Mha is in her all-new electric kitchen. Note the plywood cabinets and molded plywood handles. The counters are formica with metal trim, usually red or yellow. As a cost-cutting measure, the contractor tore out the electrical plan from the set of drawings, leaving each homeowner to come up with lighting for their houses. This was a challenge given the naturally dark quality of the exposed wood surfaces. Mha got very creative in this one, I think. While the houses were designed on a module to use standard sheets of plywood, the intricate built-up posts and beams in most of the models were time-consuming to build. Here at the upper right, you can see an electrical conduit emerging from the built-up beam. Within the sandwiched double 2x10 beam is a 3-inch cavity for electrical conduits. It was a brilliant idea, but time-consuming, and in the end led to the second contractor also going bankrupt. After just a handful of houses were completed, at that point, each MHA member was left on their own to find a contractor to finish their house. Many started over with other architects, and within our community, we have 3 Craig Elwood houses, a Neutra, 3 Cappy houses, and before it was demolished, a J.R. Davidson. As the most popular model, the MHA 111X featured a floating roof, plywood privacy walls at the front of the building, and an angular exposed masonry block fireplace and chimney with a signature round flue. As seen in Julia Schulman's photo, the back of the house is transparent to the view beyond. Each carport features a plywood storage unit, and the rear patio is contained by an articulated concrete block wall. This is the house today, and it's the Nelson's residence or the historic Wordley House. It will also be on the tour on Saturday. This is another one of my projects, which consists of restoring the house and adding a master suite and lap pool down the hill from the historic house. This is the added master suite below and the lap pool beyond. Only 3 feet of the exterior wall of the original house was removed to accommodate the staircase, so great care was taken to minimize the impact on this historic house. This iconic Schulman photo shows Model 302 that has since been demolished on Bluestone Trail and replaced by an unfortunate stucco box. Our architecture committee has not always had sympathetic members, resulting in some sad losses. Fortunately, the Schneidman house, another Model 302, was almost entirely intact when Mrs. Schneidman passed away in her 90s just a few years ago. And that's Mrs. Schneidman and her family in the foreground. The house contains similar details to the pilot house with slanted glass and articulated block. This picture shows the house just before it was purchased by the current owner, Alex and Kristen McDowell. They commissioned me as the architect on restoration and alterations. The Schneidmans had added an unfortunate addition to the front of the house, which you can just see on the right there, which we remodeled, moving the windows to the side of the house. So this is the house today, which has been lovingly restored. The living room carpet was removed to expose a beautiful dark wood floor. All block walls and painted wood were stripped and left exposed. We designed a banquette seating arrangement in the dining room, freeing up much needed space. The kitchen is the original layout with some new plywood paneling to replace damaged panels or covering appliances like a dishwasher. The original countertops would have been Formica. The Israel House on Bluestone Trail is the only MHA 105 that exists in the neighborhood, and it is in original condition. The plywood walls and cabinets have a wonderful patina, and the original red Formica counters are still seen in place. Plywood is used throughout the walls and cabinets throughout. An articulated block at the staircase creates a dynamic entrance. The 105 is one of the few two-story models with a mezzanine living room on the upper floor. Large sliding glass doors open at the corner to reveal city and ocean, and to reveal a city and ocean view beyond. This grouping shows some of the first houses built, with the Schneidman house on the hillside beyond, way up top there, and the two MHA 702 models in the foreground. The Schott house is one of the MHA 702 houses in the last picture. As Jones felt the process of planning streets and lots must include consideration for orientation and weather in relation to the house design. As he states, a house must be designed, located, and landscaped with certain principles in mind, which can greatly reduce the load of heating and cooling equipment. Orientation to catch cooling breezes or to provide protection from chilling winds, overhangs and screens to furnish shade from the hot afternoon sun, or wide glass areas to absorb the northern sunlight, ventilation to dispose of hot interior air, or insulation to retain it. Here the architects add vertical louvers on the west face to cut down on the afternoon sun, and turn down eaves, which Jones had used quite often for sun control. Along the ridgeline of this particular house are small operable windows to create a chimney effect, to let the hot air escape. Schulman took extensive photos of this house, showing the built-ins and the vertical louvers beyond. This house is now owned by John and Kathy Leader, and I believe they're second owners. Here, the operable louvers separate a study from the main living area, giving an option for privacy if needed. Typically, interior walls were either clear-heart redwood, clear-heart tongue and groove redwood, or as seen in the hallway, or Douglas fir plywood panels. And note the Ken tile on this particular model. The early visions for the community area featured a long horizontal facility with dramatic roofs, a far cry from what is there today, even though it was designed by Jones and Emmons. The original ambitious program for the community dwindled after the two different contractors went bankrupt. Members were left on their own to build, furnish, and landscape their houses, in addition to raising a family. Only the park, clubhouse, and nursery school of the grand design were completed. The park was given to the city in 1960, and the nursery school still functions today with cooperative spirit alive in parent participation. And now to another project. In 1948, San Diego builder H.C. Hivestendal felt that no one had cashed in on modern architecture for the builder's home in San Diego. He hired Jones to come up with a low-cost house of 1,200 square feet to be built on lots already purchased by owners. The house construction was to cost $8,750 and was such a success. It was published in the 1950 Architectural Forum magazine as Subdivision of the Year and won for Jones the National AIA First Honor Award. Jones felt strongly that good design should not be reserved only for the rich. The house creates a sense of drama and spatial flow on a relatively low budget. A dramatic trellis leads the visitor to the front door on the right. Jones simplified the roof and basic structure of the house, cost-saving measures taken from lessons learned from the MHA development. The similarities with the MHA housing project are striking. Both projects feature the built-up post and beams, 2x6 tongue and groove ceilings, and the signature rounded exposed fireplace chimney. But here the fireplace is a very simple construction of brick instead of the angled concrete block creations of the MHA project. Both projects have cabinets of exposed plywood with a light stain, molded plywood handles, and the newest electrical appliances. Both projects also use plywood as the finished wall surface, seen here in the kitchen, and floor-to-ceiling glass with floating interior walls to expand the space. The San Diego house features an open kitchen plan essential for the small house design. And Jones designed this unusual bunk bed arrangement, a vast improvement over the typical claustrophobic stacked arrangement. The same 1950s issue of the Architectural Forum that published the San Diego house also published an article about the developer in Northern California, Joseph Eichler, calling him the Builder of the Year. Here he's seen in the middle with Jones on the left. Eichler saw the San Diego house article and called Jones, suggesting the Builder of the Year work with the Architect of the Year. They met and with a handshake formed a working relationship that lasted until Eichler's death in 1974. With the added work in his office, Jones took on Frederick E. Emmons, shown on the right, as a partner, which lasted until Emmons retired in 1969. This is a good example of how Jones worked collaboratively with other architects and developers and engineers. In addition, he frequently created alliances with industry. For example, he designed a sun panel for Arcadia Metal Products, and Arcadia Metal Products also produced the sliding doors that Jones used and specified throughout his projects, including Eichler Homes. The most important element that Jones and Emmons contributed to the Eichler Homes development, however, was in site planning and greenbelt design. Their interest was in creating a lifestyle within a community. As Jones stated, better living can be found only in homes which not only recognize the potentialities of modern life, but which are so located in relation to their neighbors and to sources of recreation, shopping, education, and worship that they truly fulfill the aspirations of their owners. The plans favored cul-de-sac streets with public areas for community buildings, parks, and a pool. Green Meadows in Northern California became the most well-known and tightly designed Eichler development. It had a striking impact on other developers in Northern California who began to include community services when they saw the success of Green Meadow. Here are the pool, nursery school, and a recreation area. Jones and Emmons were to be one of 3 architecture firms that Eichler hired for his developments, which eventually included 11,000 homes. Anshin and Allen, the first team Eichler worked with, first came up with the atrium idea, but it was not developed until Jones and Emmons began working on designs for their homes. Indoor-outdoor living and the flexible planning were key elements of Jones' residential designs. The Atrium model became the most popular model with various configurations. The architect's concern was in creating an easy, functional space with light from the atrium penetrating the public areas of the house. The simple flat-roofed model was the most economical, with simple exposed post and beam structure. The average cost of the homes was $12,000. Only 3 of the developments were built in Southern California, all designed by Jones and Emmons' team. There's one in Fair Hills in Orange County, Balboa Highlands in Granada Hills, and Conejo Valley in Thousand Oaks. This is one of the houses in Conejo development in Thousand Oaks, as is this one photographed by Julia Schulman. Note the interior atrium with the glass walls and connection to the outside. As a model for a multi-family dwelling, the Bel-Air Apartments, constructed in 1948, included 9 luxury units. This was a departure from the moderate income single-family home Jones was previously designing. By using his innovative spatial strategies, Jones was able to create dynamic residential units at medium density. As often was the case, Jones challenged the building department to allow him to reduce the required shear wall, resulting in added glass area and a sense of openness. This shows the free flow of space within the open plan. The project proved a success for the owner, who made an annual profit of 20% versus the typical 12% for rental property. In 1953, the U.S. Gypsum Company commissioned 6 teams of architects from 6 different regions of the country to present cost-sensitive modern builders' homes for the Home Builders Exposition in Chicago. Prior to this, Jones had become interested in using steel for the housing market and for his own house in Crestwood Hills. A young Pierre Koenig worked briefly with Jones on his own house, since Koenig had already constructed steel structures of his own. Jones was intrigued with steel as a material for mass housing. As he stated, steel is readily adaptable to standardization and prefabrication. In addition, it is a material which combines flexibility with great strength in relation to its bulk, and which can be quickly and accurately placed. It is these properties that must be fully exploited in order to render application economically and aesthetically satisfying. The materials for Jones' house was delivered in 1 truck and the structure erected in 1 week. Jones and Emmons chose to explore a steel house for mass production with the U.S. Gypsum Commission, and a year after the exhibit, the homes were constructed in Barrington, Illinois. Steel framing was used primarily for commercial construction, but Jones hoped to lead the way in making it a standard material for developer homes. The house was erected in just a few weeks with steel columns and prefabricated web joists with metal roof decking. Painted colorful gypsum board with wall surfaces were flexible for hanging art. And the steel construction and concrete floors were planned to minimize fire hazards. Unfortunately, a careless worker was the cause of a fire that burned the structure to the ground. Jones and Emmons were given another chance to prove steel as a viable building material for developer homes from none other than Joseph Eichler. He commissioned Jones and Emmons to build a steel house in San Mateo. The Eichler Steel House X100 was completed in 1956. Steel beams and steel roof decking were left exposed and painted bright colors. The long spans allowed for a flexible open plan, as in Jones' own steel house. The same with Jones' steel house. Curtains separated the master bedroom from the living area. Unfortunately, cost increases due to the Korean War made steel prohibitive as a viable builder's material. Eichler referred to this X100 as his $50,000 experiment. Jones and Emmons, with an employee, John L. Chapman, created a book in 1957 geared to the developer. It was called Builders' Homes for Better Living. Using many photographs of their previous work and renderings by Chapman, the book was a how-to guide for builders of middle-income housing. They wished to improve how people lived and analyze cost-effective ways to do so. The book was written on the assumption that basic points were equally important to builder and buyer. The authors were clear to point out that a good house does not stand alone. Their primary interest was to create communities that functioned with the user in mind. They made simple suggestions aimed at the layman. Do this, don't do that, with simple illustrations. For example, by pushing the house against the lot line, it frees up space for the outdoor living. Jones viewed the living space of the house as extending all the way to the property line, connecting the interior and the exterior. The architects made suggestions to improve on the dull architecture sweeping the country. Many of these illustrations are in our guidelines for Crestwood Hills. Little was left out of their thorough study, covering grading, building orientation, plant materials, roof function, design criteria, and building material and methods. Now to another project. The 1957 Lido Sands in Newport Beach consisted of 82 homes on on an 11-acre narrow site. The land was leased to builders Jordan and Severin, who established a program requirement for low-cost houses. Lido Sands saw a return to wood construction for Jones and Emmons. Because of the small lots, Jones and Emmons ran the public street around the perimeter of the island, facing the houses inward, creating a garden-like setting along the walkway. The simple gable roof is both economical and elegant, and the public side was opaque for privacy. The rear was floor-to-ceiling glass, dissolving the boundaries of indoor and outdoor space, crucial for making a small house seem much larger. The 1,200-square-foot houses were designed to evoke the casual feel of a beach cottage. Jones and Emmons bought one house as income property, and Emmons bought one to use as a weekend house. Case study number 24 was the only large-scale house development included in John and Tenz's case study program. Typically, Jones rethought the subdivision design from scratch, considering the climate conditions of the San Fernando Valley. It is unique in that it was to be built with berms surrounding each house for thermal protection and protection from the blistering valley heat, and to establish privacy between the houses. Joseph Eichler sponsored the design, and it was proposed to the city planning department. However, they shot it down, claiming that the maintenance of the berms would become a cost problem for the city. This is a cross-section of the house showing the berms on each side. Light enters the house from the sides of the floating roof and skylights. This is the model of case study 24, and it's currently in the show here at the Hammer. Kaz Nomura, a longtime employee of A. Quincy Jones, created many of the signature renderings for Jones and Emmons, including this one for case study 24. He also did this rendering for the Palm Springs project, the Country Club Estates, a large multi-unit development finished in 1964, and it stands today. Jones and Emmons created a desert oasis with a shared pool and patio areas in a greenbelt plan. Many occupants have been in this complex since it was completed. The units are typical of the atrium design of the Eichler houses. The concrete block walls serve as a thermal material appropriate for the warmer climates of the desert. Jones' research also included high-density housing. Jones and Emmons used the Shorecliff Tower project, a 13-story apartment building, as an opportunity to try two advanced methods of concrete construction, known as slip form and lift slab. At the time of this commission, slip form was just used in elevator shafts and other tall, unbroken walls, but it was not standard practice in residential design. The unusual system consisted of pouring the walls prior to pouring the floor slabs and then hydraulically lifting the floor slabs with radiant heating coils in place slowly up the walls. One 9,000 square foot floor was poured every 4 days. The money saved in this construction was put back into the furnishings of the apartment building, and when the Emmons family sold their house in Santa Monica, they moved to this building. The Laguna Eichler Apartments in San Francisco, sponsored by Joseph Eichler and containing units very similar to the layout of Eichler Homes, began at the same time as the Shorecliff Apartments in Santa Monica. It was constructed using a reinforced cast-in-place, load-bearing walls and concrete frame. It was a proving ground for this method of construction, but still lagged behind the innovative slip form method. It was finished a year after the Shorecliff Apartments. In this 1967 study, the wood products industry sponsored a study of 140 units in a neglected slum in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. One scheme closed a public street that bisects the site in order to create a greenbelt space for daycare for children, crafts, workshops, and create a sense of community. The plan also proposed human rehabilitation by offering job training on site for entry-level work and construction, and phasing of work to avoid displacement of residents during rehabilitation work. As another innovation, Jones proposed extending the roof lines of the existing houses shown above to add infill spaces for occupants and at the same time eliminate derelict side yard spaces. Jones presented the plan to the Cleveland Planning Department, which they rejected. Elaine Sewell Jones, Jones' third wife, said that the rejection of this project was a bitter blow to Jones. This simple proposal could have solved so much for so little. Through his close analysis of users' needs and building methods, Jones was able to improve the level of moderate income housing, often challenging planning departments along the way. He was unusual as an architect in putting comfort and enjoyment of the occupants first. In conclusion, there is much to be learned from the work of A. Quincy Jones in regards to future housing developments here and around the world. Builders in developing countries would do well to consider Jones' community plans, creating a lifestyle that balances privacy with community. The exuberance, inventiveness, and sheer beauty of Jones' work has been an inspiration to many, and I include myself among those. Thank you.
I'm Nicholas Olsberg, and we raised some questions last week about the possibility of some of these early examples for contemporary and future developments. And I'm particularly concerned to think about how we handle the massive urbanization that's going to be happening, not necessarily in our society, but in many societies around the world. 250 million Chinese within 10 years are going to be urbanized, whether they wish to be or not. And there is a massive migration from most rural communities in most developing areas to urban areas. There are new cities being built everywhere. And we are dealing with infill projects and closer living and living with more adjacency to the services we use, which is a necessity as we face global warming and its challenges. So I wanted to ask whether you think any of these, specifically any of these projects, could apply.
Well, I think if we're talking about China, the towers possibly, because that's their mode of development, and should be their mode of development, given that their agricultural areas are so important, that really the spread out family home doesn't work in that particular situation.
I'm interested in the Shorecliff, in how he orients them so that everybody gets a view, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do in something that high. How does he actually pull that off?
Well, each unit has a deck, and there's a view to the, it's to the south and to the north. So the north on one side of the building, the south on the other. And then obviously the prime end units have corner views.
Right. Is there a contemporary Eichler? Is there anyone now who is thinking in development with the imagination that Eichler did?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm unprepared for that one. I can only think of possibly the Living Homes is trying to accomplish something like that. Can't think of anyone offhand.
And what about the current prefabrication movements that are underway? They're not Eichler homes, which were not in fact prefabricated. Right. And I think one of the brilliant things about Quincy Jones is how he uses a basic plan and always varies it, so that there are very many options within the same plan for different ways to live, which I think is one of the most inventive things he does. I think in the best sense of the term, he's an architect, a master of accommodation. He accommodates your needs as you specify them, sometimes a little too much, I think, but if you're too rich and ask for it again and again, he says yes. But I think in many of the more modest projects, he is really looking to the fact that not every household lives the same way, and that he allows that to proceed. I think that's very, very interesting.
Yeah. I think it was Dan McMasters in the Los Angeles Times article was commenting on some of the luxury homes and saying that it's sometimes easier to build a small house than a very large house, because in a lot of ways the grand houses lose that intimate character that he had of indoor-outdoor space and of the special detailing. Well, they're detailed, but just the small cabinet-like feeling of the buildings themselves.
One of the things that interests me about the more upscale houses he does, which you didn't address that much, it's not our primary interest at the moment, is that he's dealing in LA with difficult sites nearly always. So it may be a very grand house, it may be a very expensive house, it may be expensive site that the owners had to pay a lot of money for, but it still has difficulty with adjacencies, with slope, with vista, and he seems to very cleverly work with those constraints. And I think, I mean, one of the questions that Quincy Jones's career asks me is, why was he more successful than the others in terms of numbers of clients and volume of work he could do? And some of it seems to me that ability to adapt to needs and to site and the demands of the owner.
That's right. I mean, the user was of primary importance, not style. So he wasn't typecast. He could take any project and try to experiment structurally and with the user in mind and create something really different. And I think because he didn't stick with one particular style like Neutra or Schindler, he is less well known because he really did focus on the user, and each project is individual in a sense.
I had one personal question, or one thing that may interest me more than others, and that is that looking at the exhibition, I do know the archives too pretty well, and seeing some of these drawings, why are the drawings so busy? Why is the building so hard to perceive behind all of this?
Oh, the renderings? Behind the renderings?
Incredible jazziness in the rendering.
Oh, well, it's a good question. Jones had an older brother who died fairly young, who was an artist. And Jones had an interest in rendering very early on. And he drew all of his life. Every time he traveled, he had very intricate travel drawings. And he loved to draw in the office. And then he started a relationship with Kaz Nomura. And all of his drawings are very busy. And I think that I'm not sure why, other than the love of the drawing line, that he really did like that. And it was... It's
just you look at someone like Ain or Soriano. Ain, who just puts little dots for the sun and the shadow and uses a minimal drawing technique to show essentially minimal structures. Rafael Soriano, who's, I mean, in these absolutely ravishing drawings, just shows the structure and the light. And then you look at Quincy Jones, and they're so over-dynamic.
Yeah, they are.
Is he trying to hide something?
No, I don't think he is. I think he's just has a love of line and color. And
yeah, and he's somebody who was beloved by everybody who got to meet him.
Absolutely. He's a very social creature.
A lovely man whom everybody loved to work with. And so maybe some of that sort of exuberance is there in the drawings, and that's what's really they're about. Yeah. Okay, can we ask people for questions?
So I have to confess, I moved here from Cleveland, Ohio, and I was stunned to see that last design, which I just Googled. I was more stunned because I discovered it's in the Huff neighborhood in Cleveland, which is a really impoverished neighborhood that has gone through tremendous economic decline. It was the site of some riots and things. And so I'm particularly interested if somebody whose work was so sensitive to the environment in California, and as you talked about the relationship between inside and out, how would he end up doing a project, quote unquote, so far from home? And then do you think part of the problems with the plans of things were he was working in an environment that he wasn't familiar with versus the success he had convincing, not consistently, but convincing developers here?
Well, I think he did do a wide range of projects in other states. There's work in Texas, Arizona, and the U.S. Gypsum Project was back in Illinois. So I mean, he did spread out quite a bit, and I think this was more like a competition. So he would have been aware of any competition that's out there. I think he handled it pretty well, actually. It's not a California style. He's taking that steep gable roof and he's continuing that on. It was very effective in sort of eliminating the sort of dead, actually dangerous side yard areas that were there. So I think, but he was very disappointed that his plan wasn't accepted, and I guess nothing's been done with it, as you insinuate. So. It's really a shame.
Could they be done now? I mean, it's an absolutely brilliant infill solution. It's a phenomenal way to expand space in an economical way.
I doubt if Cleveland has any money, but it certainly The plans are there if anybody wants to.
Corey, my first introduction to Quincy Jones was meeting Elaine at the Eames office. And when I worked there, it was always made clear that Quincy and Elaine were very good friends of Charles and Ray. So do you have anything to say about that and that relationship? Because I know it was for long standing and they were very fond of each other.
Yes, they did have a very long relationship. Very early on, you see most of Jones' projects are furnished with Eames furniture. And I can't think of the top of my head any clever stories about it, but they did have a high respect for each other. And I know Elaine and Ray remained friends long after the other two passed away. Can you add any stories?
I'll tell you an interesting factoid. Walt Disney, born in a suburb of St. Louis in approximately 1902, I think. Charles Eames, born in St. Louis, approximately 1901, 1902. And Quincy Jones, born in Kansas City, 1913. And as Midwesterners, they all came to LA and found their fortunes. Charles and Walt were not buddies, but they knew very much of each other, and they were very aware that they were doing similar ambitious things. Mm-hmm. So any thoughts about Midwesterners coming to California in the post-war period?
That's a question about Midwesterners? I think that architects flocked to California right after the war because there was so much work. And it was an experimental environment. There were a lot of new building materials. The climate was conducive to this open, modern plan. They flocked from everywhere, especially people who had been stationed during the war, got a taste of California and came back. And that's why there was such a housing shortage right after the war, that the architects were certainly very willing and happy to fill.
I can add something there, if I may. This was, until 1938-39, a Midwestern city on the sea. That is, there were whole areas, whole new developments came from one town in Iowa, and it was named after that. There were reunions of communities from the Midwest throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And then I forget how many millions, but it's something like 6 million GIs did their rest and recreation in Los Angeles, many of them from the Midwest. And they came back to build their homes and make their families here after the war. So I think we forget the relationship between LA and the Midwest, and that many of the architects, earlier architects, were not Harvard and Princeton, but were from Midwestern schools. And they came from that world, and they knew that world, and especially Chicago, which was a great source of the source, obviously, of Irving Gill and Myron Hunt and the Wrights, the two sons that were here, and so on. Mm-hmm.
I'm struck by no mention yet of Frank Lloyd Wright. What was Wright's sense of this fellow's work and vice versa?
Well, there are actually a couple interesting stories. I think at least 3 projects they competed against each other. And with the project Town and Country that A. Quincy Jones did with Paul Williams, let's see, it was, what's his name, Daphne. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name. Anyway, there was one client that saw that building who had, yes, it was the Daphne Funeral Home up in San Francisco. That's right. They had originally hired Frank Lloyd Wright. He stopped at Town and Country and saw the architecture and was so impressed that he contacted A. Quincy Jones, and he fired Frank Lloyd Wright and hired A. Quincy Jones. Then there was another project, I believe it was in Beverly Hills, that Jones had been hired, and then he was fired, and Frank Lloyd Wright was hired. And then there was another one, I can't think of it right offhand. But there was a competition, certainly. I wouldn't say they were friends. In fact, there is no communication that I know of between the two.
Hi, Corey. What's striking about the photography in your book and in your presentation is how bare the hills were. Yeah. No trees whatsoever. Mm-hmm. What were the landscape architecture concepts that came about after the houses were completed. How did we get all these beautiful trees, and where did they come from?
The Crestwood Hills development?
Yeah.
Well, Garrett Ekbo had proposed a project, a plan that had what the community members considered too exotic. There were palm trees and avocado trees, but interestingly enough, he had planned the trees to be built stepping down the hill. And because of the contractors going bankrupt and people being left on their own, the sort of general overall plan for landscaping didn't happen. So each house was on their own. Garrett Ekbo was actually fired from the project after he presented his exotic planting plan, and he was very distraught about that. But unlike Mar Vista Housing, where Garrett Ekbo continued as the landscape architect and his plan was implemented, ours is, Crestwood Hills is just a mishmash of constant aggravation for the tree committee because everything has grown out of control. It's a shame. It's a shame Garrett Ekbo didn't follow through with it, wasn't allowed to follow through with it.
I was hoping you might explain a little bit more about raising the floors 9,000 square feet and how that figured into the heating. Perhaps I misunderstood.
Oh, the heating coils were cast in the floor system itself, and then the concrete floor with the heating system in it was lifted up. Every 4 days, they lifted up that entire 9,000 square foot floor area. Of that particular construction? Well, I think he was one of the first to do it for an apartment building like that.
Hi, Corey. A slightly impish question. In the big scale plans like Crestwood Hills, where you have the community area, the preschool, all these different areas, and then you have the place of worship, how are they going to decide what kind of church it would be? It just said worship.
I did, but there was no church involved.
He was the one who said to worship as well. One of the things I've discovered about these communities, these cooperatives, because there are 4 by Frank Lloyd Wright as well that I've gone to look at and meet the people. It was under special act of Congress that permitted you to buy the land in common and then divide it. And they're called Rochdale Cooperatives after the city of Rochdale, which is near where I grew up, where the pioneers started the cooperative movement. I found that a lot of them are interracial and interethnic, and were at the time. And that one of the reasons for these cooperative communities being so popular with musicians in particular was because of the nature of their families, often being composed of interracial or interethnic marriages, and in Los Angeles, even more than in New York and the Midwest, the exclusionary clauses in other suburbs were extreme. So it was in fact impossible for them to buy a house unless it was in such a situation. And you don't, of course, you don't discover this until you go and speak to them, and you find that they are mixed race, and it's really, really interesting. So I think that the idea that they had common worship places when you're talking about those kind of situations, very interesting. It's Bohemia too. So I mean, these cooperatives, communities, Ekbo's Wonderland, which we talked about last week, is very much a bohemian community, and sort of assembled by people who didn't want to do things in conventional ways. But they were also, as a result, and Quincy Jones and Whitney Smith both complain about this, the fact that they're so individualistic makes 500 of them incredibly difficult to work with.
Yes. The contractors learned that right.
And I think this is an issue too for now. If you're going to move in, I think a cooperative development model is a wonderful one to consider as we go forward, but how do you get agreement when households now are even more diverse than they were then?
Right.
Do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I don't. I don't think that the community members within Crestwood Hills were focused on religion. They were primarily a Jewish population, but I don't even know of any temple that was mentioned as a focus on these groups. Like you say, they're primarily a bohemian group. When still are.
Red diaper kids. They're red diaper kids. They don't care about their churches and synagogues.
That's right.
Hi, Corey.
Hi.
Terrific. Just a curiosity about the contractors going broke.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think that the architects would have a sense of what these houses cost, I guess from the materials point of view. So where did they go so wrong? Was it in the labor? What, how could these houses, come out costing so much more than they had anticipated? And following up on that, it seems like only a fraction of the original Crestwood houses were then built. So if you could elaborate a little more on how that all came about, it seems like a very interesting subject.
Well, I should have mentioned that 160 of the original 350 of the houses were built. And so that obviously a lot of the owners hired their own contractors for this. 45 of the houses were burned in the Bel-Air fire, and a lot of the houses have been remodeled. It's a little off subject, but a lot have been remodeled or demolished, so we have only about 32 of the houses remaining now. I know you want to comment on this, but I'll just say briefly that the architects had thought and had planned for the houses to be pretty much on a module, and thinking that that would be cost effective. I think their downfall were these built-up posts, which really had to fit together like a cabinet. It was not easy to do those, very intricate. And Jones learned that lesson, because when he did the Eichler Homes, they were no longer built up. They were just simple posts and beams. Also, Jones and any of the architects he worked with produced very detailed drawings. Every detail was called out. So there was no play with this contractor. He had to build it as per plan. Very solid foundations. I think that the contractors just completely underestimated it and committed themselves to a certain number. It was such a kindness that the first contractor gave $3,000 of his own money to each house. That would be unheard of today, even though the cost would be 10 times that or 100 times that.
No, I think that's all. There's one other aspect to it, which is a special post-war condition, which is for the years from 1946 through around 1951, the price of materials was totally unpredictable, and the availability of materials, as with rearmament, suddenly placing special demands. One year you could use lumber, next year you had to use steel, next year you couldn't use either. Then there was the steel strikes. It just went on and on and on, and the price of materials was incredibly unpredictable. Delivery was hard. The oil crises that kept on happening, delayed shipments. It was incredibly hard to actually control costs unless you were using lath and stucco. Mm-hmm. So I think contractors had a very difficult time estimating because you couldn't project. That went on for a long time, and it's a real pity because so many of these material experiments were eventually abandoned because of that, and we ended up with balloon frame stucco houses everywhere.
Right.
I toured Sunnylands just this last Sunday, and I was struck by the dissonance of the interior design and furniture and furnishings of the Annenbergs and the exterior design by Quincy Jones. And I know that's partly because they had their own interior designer who worked in the Hollywood Regency style, who stuck with that. But my first question is, how did that happen? How did Quincy Jones pair on a project where he must have known that the interior was going to be very out of step with what he was designing? And second of all, how common was it for the more modest homes that he designed to have people who would buy the homes move into them and then furnish them not with Herman Miller and Eames furnishings, but overstuffed, embroidered stuff that they brought with them?
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, when my husband and I moved into the community, and we first moved in 95 and bought another house, not the one that you saw on the screen. So I got to meet some of the original owners, like Ray Siegel, and I was surprised by the flowered couches and the what are those things called, Barker loungers or whatever they are. and it actually was fairly consistent that a lot of the original owners had a very different idea of furnishing from what A. Quincy Jones would have expected. I saw very few Eames pieces. I think there was not a lot of thought. They just wanted their houses to be comfortable, and there were some built-ins in the houses. There was a disconnect, definitely, that we saw when we first moved into the community. As far as Sunnylands, Ted Haynes, I believe, was the interior designer on that one, and Jones had worked with Ted Haynes before on the Gary Cooper house in Beverly Hills. So I think he knew what he was getting into. I don't think he had a very close working relationship with him, but I may be wrong about that.
Lily Haynes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did I say Ted? Yeah. I find the whole place shocking myself. I think this was a case where it was a very powerful client. Jones was interested in working on a large project like that, but I think her demands for a sort of Aztec feel or style was so contrary to what Jones did with his work, because he really explored the user's demands and requests and program rather than a style. So I think he was a little bit set off track that way with that project.
Maybe we can end about here, but I think there's a question now. So the restoration, the money that has been spent in restoring Sunnylands, could have been better spent?
Oh, no, I don't feel that way. I mean, it's a period piece, and it's their money. They can restore it any way they like. And it certainly is a draw for people, and Fred Fisher's done a wonderful job with the visitor center, and the gardens are incredible. So I don't, it's all fair game, I think.
I'm just curious, fantastic lecture presentation, thank you. I'm just curious about the property in Palm Springs. Can people go visit it? You know, what's that about? What's the address?
Sunnylands? You could look it up online.
Okay.
It's the visitor center and the gardens, I think, are very accessible. I think you probably have to make an appointment to see the house.
I think some of the best architects have done their worst work in Palm Springs. The Bob Hope House by John Lautner is not his masterpiece, and he would be the first to admit that. There was sometimes too much money is a very bad thing for an architect. And anything you want to add? Or?
No, I think that's it.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.